SoundCartel.
In this episode, we conclude our chat with David Brown, host of Wondery's Business Wars, Business Wars Daily and WeCrashed. This episode taking a look at how Wondery monetises its podcasts.
What I love about the way that Wondery approaches this is that there is the flexibility so that I can say, I don't think I can do the erectile dysfunction ad because it's just not, I'm a little too embarrassed. I just can't do that one.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nick Schildberger, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 5 of season 4. And welcome to my co-host, Nicole Goodman.
G'day, Nick. I can't wait to get into this second episode with David Brown, but we did promise we'd discuss sonic branding last time, and in particular how we developed the SoundCartel sonic brand.
Yes, we did, but before we get to our own sonic brand, I'm wondering whether you could explain sonic branding and I guess what audio branding more broadly is and why it's so important.
Yeah, sure. Look, it really is an extension of how a brand looks and feels. We're very comfortable with looking at branding guidelines and the colours and associations with the brand on that level. This is just, again, an extension of how your brand sounds. So from any jingles you might have in advertising, how someone picks up the phone when a customer calls, what voiceover artist you might use on ads. All of these represent your business and reflect how your business sounds.
And how it's remembered as well.
Exactly, and how it's remembered.
Now, specifically talking about the sonic brand, which is a short music or sound bed, they're really powerful because they can really access our emotions. And there's a huge opportunity for brands to convey meaning and invoke an emotional response via the use of these sometimes very short music stings or sounds, and they become really memorable.
Absolutely, Nick. And it's emotion that's really important in this whole process. People tend to think of it more as a logical response, but really a brand or a business can tell people what to think about them till the cows come home. But really, it's what people's perception of that business or brand is that really counts and is actually what creates the living brand. Music has a very important way of eliciting emotions. So if you're able to do that as a brand or a business, to use music and sound as part of your branding to make people feel differently, go ahead and do that.
And if you're not, you're missing a huge opportunity.
Absolutely.
Now, I mentioned that some are very memorable, so I'm going to put you to the test.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Here we go.
I'm going to play some of the most well-known,
Yes.
in my opinion.
Yes.
I'll start with some easy ones.
Okay.
We've been in isolation,
I'm scared.
watching a lot of TV, so there's a hint. Here's the first one.
Okay. Movie, 20th Century Fox. Woohoo! Do-do-do-do. Do-do-do-do.
Okay, very good. 20th Century Fox. You're off to a good start. Next one, it's a short one, so listen carefully. Here it comes.
It's my favourite sound, Nick. Netflix.
Very good. Okay, and now some quick-fire ones.
Yep.
Here we go.
Samsung.
Very good. I didn't think you would get that one.
I'm not a Samsung girl, but there you go.
Okay, the next one. Here we go.
Macca's.
And last one.
Opening a Mac.
Now, there isn't much to that, but you knew straight away. You are a Mac user, but straight away you knew
I knew it.
Apple.
Correct. Yes.
Now, we promised we would talk about our own sonic brand, the
We did.
SoundCartel, and the story behind it. So how about you kick things off?
Yeah, sure. Look, it went through a number of iterations, and our head of audio, Pete Letts, was putting it together. And I think he started with throwing some sounds in and some beats and different things, trying to pull something together. But it really wasn't until he started thinking about what was important to him, or that's something that he was really passionate about. And he really is a lover of analog, a lover of Morse code, actually. And when he was thinking about our origin story, the SoundCartel origin story, the fact that we're coming out of an older space into a new era of audio, he used that actually to inspire him to create what is now our sonic brand, the sonic brand for SoundCartel, and he created SoundCartel in Morse code, which, Nick, you have that there ready to
yes,
play.
Yes, it sounds like this.
It's amazing.
Now, on its own, that is not probably the most inspiring sonic brand.
No, absolutely not. But it was a spark. It was something that set him off to think, right, what can we do with this and how can we build on it? And so then he decided to look at what happens if he sped it up, which he did.
Now, you might have missed that, so I'll do it again.
Yeah.
Now, that, again, doesn't sound like much on its own, but Pete was getting very excited by this point.
Yeah, and he was encouraged enough by what he'd put together to actually put himself behind the drums, put some beats together, and he came up with what is now our sonic brand.
You've already heard it at the top of this show, but I'll play it again now that you've heard the story. This is our sonic brand.
SoundCartel.
What's really interesting about it is that within that sonic brand is actually our DNA. I mean, quite literally, the Morse code of SoundCartel is in that instrumental piece, as well as representing SoundCartel really well in this new era of audio. Creating a sonic brand for your business is really something you need to be not only cognizant about what it is you're offering and what it is you do, but something that you should be passionate about. And I think the turning point for Pete and for us as a business was when Pete became connected to what he was doing. And the moment he thought of Morse code, he got incredibly excited. I got incredibly excited, and so did you, Nick. It really became a point where we went, right, we're onto something here. And it blossomed from there.
There were about 700 versions before this one, so it was, in the end, a work of art, and we love it. The team loves it.
Yeah, and we can only hope that, therefore, that connection builds to our clients and our audience. So if you're starting there, you can't really go too wrong.
And I think the story behind it too that we just told there is important as well, that we understand the story behind our own sonic brand. Two huge brands that have gone through a reinvention of their sonic brand in the last couple of years are Coca-Cola and Mastercard. And we haven't got time to go into more detail here because we really must get to David Brown. But in our show notes, I'll link to a short video for each of them where Coke tells a story and where Mastercard tell the story of their sonic brand. And it's another example of how the biggest brands in the world are doing exactly what we've been discussing.
That's it.
So we must get to David Brown and finish our interview with him, in fact. The first part of this interview was in episode 4 of this season of Podcasting Essentials, so check it out if you haven't already.
Look, as a reminder, David Brown is a journalist and radio news host based in Dallas, Texas. He's best known today as the host of Wondery's Business Wars and Business Wars Daily. Wondery monetizes its shows with advertising, many of which are host-read, including Business Wars. So we asked David what his thoughts are on the effectiveness of host-read ads.
This is probably beyond my pay grade, but I will say that from what I understand about the industry, the host-read ads are especially effective. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know quite why, but I do know that apparently they are, and that there's a real premium in the podcasting world on, it's not just host-read ads, but host experiences. And so quite often you'll find that advertisers want the host to say, try sleeping on a Casper mattress, or try whatever it is that they're pitching. Like if it's, I don't know, I'm just throwing this out there, a vitamin or a particular kind of coffee that they're selling. They want you to try it, and they want you to be sincere about it. And so what's fascinating, now that I know behind the scenes how this happens, they'll send you like a sample to try and all that kind of thing. I'm listening awfully closely to my colleagues as they talk about these things. Are they enthusiastic about it? Or is it that they're just getting through it? And so I think that a lot of listeners pick up on that. And either it comes out or it doesn't. I'll tell you something that's really kind of funny, and I'm not sure how much I should say about this, but I'll go ahead and bear it all. We had, I don't think you have Lincoln motor cars down there in Australia, do you?
No,
you have
no, we
Fords.
don't. Yes.
We have Lincolns here. They're sort of Cadillac's sort of rival, I suppose. And Lincoln wanted to try out podcasting advertising. They wanted to do something with Business Wars, and they asked if I'd be open to it. Now, they're not going to give me a Lincoln, unfortunately. But as it happens, I'm kind of a car nut, like I'm a motorcycle guy. And I know a lot about Lincoln, and I know a lot about its history. So I was really enthusiastic to do this particular podcast that was built around part of the history of Lincoln. That was very authentic. And I love doing it. I love trying it out. I don't know but it was an experiment for Lincoln as much as it was an experiment for us. And it was authentically enthusiastic from my perspective because I felt like I'm talking about something that I'm really pretty passionate about. Now, the pitch work was a little odd. And part of this is because I am a journalist at heart. And doing what I'm doing now with Wondery, with Business Wars and that sort of thing, it's a different animal. As a public radio journalist, I don't do commercials. So this is a new thing where I'm talking about something and saying, hey, try it. But I have to say, I enjoyed it. And I actually enjoy doing the host-read ads. And one thing that I do also like about the way that Wondery approaches this, they ask if it's okay for us to do this particular retailer. And if I don't want to do it, we don't have to do it, which is pretty great.
Oh.
I'm not familiar with any other business model that has given me that much latitude.
Yeah.
For instance, I don't drink. So we've had some alcohol advertisers. I don't mind advertising alcohol. It's just that as it happens, I don't partake. So I can't give you the rich experience of what it's like to have this particular vodka or whatever. But I can tell you what the advertiser wants me to tell you, and you're not going to get that firsthand account. That's just the way that is. But what I love about the way that Wondery approaches this is that there is the flexibility so that I can say, I don't think I can do the erectile dysfunction ad because it's just not, I'm a little too embarrassed. I just can't do that one. And that's pretty great. But there are some situations where I feel like the host, they're kind of shoehorned into having to do some of those things. Thankfully, I don't have to do a lot of those things. So I'm grateful.
Some of the ads are woven into the story of Business Wars as well. Do you know if Wondery seeks out advertisers that are going to fit the Business Wars story, or is it just an opportunistic thing that if an ad can be written to sort of slide into the storyline that happens that way?
It's interesting that you would say that it was written into the storyline because the only thing I can think of where it was directly written into the storyline was Lincoln. But otherwise, what's happening is these ads are being dropped in at these apropos moments. And so that's the mastery of the separate advertising team. They work separate from the script team. So quite often what you're hearing in Australia is not the same ad that, say, American listeners are hearing. So if you're sensing a kind of seamlessness, it's because the way that the ad script was written, it just kind of flowed. But typically that seamlessness is just a triumph of the format.
Mm-hmm. On things more production-focused, obviously producing a daily show is a very different beast to producing something monthly. What's your preference? Do you prefer the pace of Business Wars Daily versus the longer-form monthly podcast?
I think I like the bi-weeklies because doing the dailies, we're sort of doing 5 in a row. So it's sit down, blam, 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 and then we're done. And from a satisfaction level, I don't know, I feel like I'm dipping my toe into these 5 subjects, and it's just not enough for me. It's fun to listen to in the morning when you're getting ready for work or something, and that's kind of what it serves, is that wake up in the morning, let's get sort of up to speed on what's happening with the news, and that's great. But what I really like about Business Wars is that it's immersive and that it has a sort of intimacy that I really like. It's one of the reasons I like listening to podcasts, and that's what, to me at least, is much more challenging. And as someone who really is interested in business and in history, I learn a lot more doing those longer form 30-minute pieces.
Mm-hmm. Our audience to this podcast is mainly medium and large businesses. Mm-hmm. What lessons do you think they can take away from listening to Business Wars?
I think it's interesting. I don't know how much we've talked about this publicly, but we've been thinking quite a lot about a book. You've heard of Sun Tzu's Art of War. We've been thinking quite a lot about doing a sort of the Art of Business Wars, where we're compiling a bunch of lessons from these battles and putting it together as a book. And I'm excited about how we're moving forward with this. But I think one of the things that comes out very consistently is that hubris is such an enemy, and we are so, if you're right in the middle of something, it's so difficult to see yourself as others see you. It's also interesting that we forget quite often that this really is about sometimes the smallest sort of human rivalries. And quite often it's not about the things that you learn getting your MBA. Quite often decisions are made because of very intimate personal reasons. And this happens all the time in business. One example, with the Blockbuster, for example, Blockbuster had become such an incredible success that they couldn't believe that it was possible for some upstart to come out of the blue and do things better than they could. It was that basic. They just couldn't imagine that some upstart could come out and distribute DVDs. It wasn't streaming. It was about sending you DVDs in the mail.
Yeah.
They couldn't believe that that would be a better business model than the brick and mortar stores that they had all over the world. It was just inconceivable to these folks. And then once that model took off, Blockbuster scrambled to try to replicate it and figured, well, if these guys can do it, goodness, we can do the same. We'll just copy their website. It was the weakest kind of response, but it was very much driven by a sense of we can do no wrong. And that is consistent. You find it in almost every business war. You have someone who is the reigning champion, and they just don't see the rival coming. And by the time they do, it's too late. And when they're scrambling to try to catch up, they have to really kind of reinvent themselves. And if they don't reinvent themselves, they often die. They often fall by the wayside. So, you start to see little patterns like that come out. But that's, I think, what makes, in general, these clashes of the titans so interesting, is that you can sort of see it coming. You can see it coming. Where's it going to happen? Oh, no!
It really is about people needing to get out of their own way and the human instincts that drive people either positively or negatively.
Oh, yeah.
When you refer to these titans of business, some of the business wars you've covered are businesses that go back more than 100 years. Mm-hmm. And we see them now as these huge businesses. But what I found interesting is that in many cases, these big businesses have gone through, they've been the market leader and then almost been overtaken and then come back in recent decades to be the leader again. I think that was really fascinating how, and it's all about the people, who's in charge at the right time, making those gut feel decisions to get the business back to its former glory.
I think you're right about that. And I think part of what's telling about that is often you have to bring in people who are completely fresh, who feel like they own this business that used to be the champion and is now struggling. They have to sort of own it, and they become a kind of, quite often, a personification of that business. There are some classic examples. If you think of Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or any of the greats, that's where it's the most vivid. But in almost every instance of what you're describing there, you could talk about Mattel, or you could talk about Coca-Cola, or you could talk about any number of giants. You could say, wow, that's what happened. Somebody fresh had to come in there and say, hey, this isn't right. We used to be on top, and now we're going to think like the underdog. And sort of start with a fresh perspective, realizing that you can't take any of that stuff. You can't take the past for granted. You can't take your past success as any kind of indication of future performance, as they say.
Now, for our listeners that are looking to produce their own podcast, in your view, what are the key ingredients that go into making an award-winning podcast?
It's a difficult one because I think that it's sort of like the bar for entry is so low for doing a podcast that it can be a little deceiving.
Yes.
It's like when Amazon was starting out, it seemed like a pretty simple idea, right? Who couldn't start a website and sell other people's books? It just seemed like a very simple idea. And podcasting is the same way in a sense, because almost anyone can start a podcast. But I do think that there are a few things that sort of make the successful ones successful. And it depends on what level you want to think about this. But I do think that you first have to be very businesslike in your approach to your podcast. Who is your audience? Where is the level of demand? What are your targets? What are your benchmarks? Where do you want to be in 6 months with this? Are you positive that you want to make this kind of commitment for the long haul, because your podcast will not succeed if you're going to do it sort of in a spotty way. If you're going to do a podcast, you're going to go out of the gate really strong, and you get a podcast every week. Can you keep that up, and for how long? And how much time are you willing to commit to it? How much money are you willing to commit to it? And you really have to be honest about that. And as you see demand grow, how much are you willing to water that garden? All of these things need to be very carefully and realistically thought through. And I think that that's what everyone, it seems, has a podcast these days. It's almost like, who doesn't have a podcast? But the thing is, there are a lot of, I won't want to say failed podcasts, but there are a lot of podcasts that got started and then just kind of withered on the vine because they didn't attract the audience that the creators aspired to originally. And a lot of that is because of unrealistic expectations and that sort of thing.
Yes, yeah.
We live in the era of the long tail. And so you have to be comfortable with the idea that you might not get more than 5 to 10 to 25 listeners in those early days, and they might just be your friends. But ultimately, you're going to put everything you can into maximizing the significance of the number of hits that you do receive. And you're going to find ways to advertise, and get that out there. You're going to think about the indices that matter to your listeners. Like, how do you find a podcast? Well, maybe you go on Apple Podcasts and you see what's in the top 10 and you think, I'll try that one on. Well, if that's the way that you're thinking about the industry, and it's not a bad way to think about it, by the way, then you need to think very, very hard about how long it's going to take you to get on that top 10 and plot out your strategy, realistically speaking. And if you're not halfway there in half a year, or whatever you decide is going to be your benchmark, you really need to decide, okay, I'm going to start over, or I'm going to pull the plug, or I'm going to make the investment here that it's going to take, even if that means making a massive investment in advertising. Conventional advertising or Facebook advertising or online advertising. You're going to do whatever it takes to get the word out. But a lot of this is really about word of mouth and about advertising and making sure that people are subscribing and listening, especially if you're driven by ad revenue, because it's all about the number of ears, if that's the model that you've built your podcast around.
Mm-hmm. No, you're right. So what do you think about the explosion of podcasting? Do you prefer the medium of radio over podcasting, or vice versa?
I'll be honest, I didn't see podcasting coming. It was funny because I'm ashamed to admit this, one of my first thesis papers when I was working on my doctorate was on how podcasting was going to be a flash in the pan.
Wow.
And I actually presented that as a paper. I hope it's not available out there online somewhere. Don't look for it. But in any event, the thing is, I think, honestly, there's an example of what hubris is. I got caught up in the fact that I really love the medium of radio because it's so unforgiving and it's immediate and it's intimate and it's got all these great things that podcast has, but it's also, there's a certain electricity about radio because it's happening right now. And notwithstanding the fact that you can sure pre-tape things, pre-tape segments and so on and so forth. But in radio news, you don't do that much of it. You're pretty much live. And so I love radio for that. But I will say that now I feel like we're experiencing a golden age of radio in a way with podcasts because the craft of radio, which had been lost since the days of Orson Welles and War of the Worlds and when people would gather around the radio set, that's back.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, and that's exciting, you know?
It is, yeah.
So it's hard not to be enthusiastic about podcasts and feel like, wow, this is where it's all happening. And it is where it's all happening. And of course, the death of radio, that story's been written many, many times over the past half century or more. And so I never believed that radio is really down for the count. And maybe we're creating a whole new audience of radio listeners, who knows? But I do believe that podcasting is where it's at right now, and it's exciting to be a small part of it.
We couldn't agree more.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, David, last question. Obviously, you're working on some really exciting projects at the moment, but what's coming up for you? Are there any new podcasts on the horizon?
And is there any chance of a business war based on an Australian business war?
Yes.
Wow. Oh, gee.
No pressure.
That's a good one. No. To be honest, I don't know what is in the cooker right now. I wish I could say that I do know that we've just finished Boeing versus Airbus.
Yes.
And I've been working on a series it has not debuted yet, but it's on Dunkin' Donuts versus Starbucks.
Okay.
And learning a lot about how that came about. It's funny because here there's sort of Starbucks represents class as much as it does actually coffee. It's a kind of a cosmopolitan thing. And Dunkin' Donuts is very much a working class sort of Dunkin' Donuts. It's got the big one, the big cup of coffee. And it's sort of like the blue collar versus the well-educated upper middle class coffee drinker. And that's sort of the business word that's coming out next. I wish I could say for sure that, we're going to be doing – do you have a recommendation? See, that's something I should have been asking.
Of Australian businesses.
You guys. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you could do News Corp if we're talking about the Murdochs. Yeah.
And that's something we invite people to do. Go over to Wondery.com and pitch some ideas. And we've gotten some terrific ideas from listeners. So maybe some of your listeners have some suggestions for some business wars that we can try that have a certain resonance down under.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, David, for joining us on Podcasting Essentials. It's been an absolute thrill to speak to you.
It's been amazing.
Well, it's been an absolute honor for me. Thank you so much for asking me. I really do appreciate it.
It's been wonderful. Thank you, David. Take care.
Cheers.
We've had so much great feedback from our first episode with David Brown. I hope you all enjoy this one just as much.
He's a popular guy and a great host.
He is.
I loved what he said about the lessons we can take from business wars. It's so interesting that so many people go study really hard business and economics and they do MBAs, but really what brings these titans of industry down is hubris at the end of the day. It's the frailty of human emotion, our ego, and not seeing the other guy coming, as David pointed out.
I really do hope they pull the book together that he mentioned, The Art of Business Wars.
Yes, that'll be fantastic.
Although, could we suggest it would be an audiobook?
Yes, Nick, it should definitely be an audiobook.
Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me as always.
Always my pleasure, Nick.
Now, if you haven't already, we'd love you to check out our new website at soundcartel.com.au and our very own daily business podcast, Business Essentials Daily. From all of us at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.